They found him beneath the frozen soil of Denmark, a warrior laid in rest, sword across his chest, a polished axe by his side, a bronze brooch still clinging to fabric that had long since turned to dust. Every inch of the grave screamed Viking, the weapons, the ornaments, the ritual, all perfect. But when scientists opened his bones, the truth didn't whisper. It screamed. This man, this supposed Norse hero, was no Scandinavian. His DNA traced not north, but south, to the Mediterranean, Italian, Balkan, maybe even Anatolian. A Viking with Roman blood. And suddenly, the myths we've carried for centuries, the stories of the blonde-haired conquerors of the north, began to tremble. Because he wasn't the only one. From Scotland to Ukraine, graves marked as Viking revealed DNA that had nothing to do with Norway, Denmark, or Sweden. A mosaic of identities buried beneath Viking shields. The question became impossible to ignore. Who were the Vikings, really? And what if the word Viking never meant a people, but a transformation? Before we go deeper into the mystery, before we uncover how science shattered one of history's greatest myths, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to hear will rewrite everything you thought you knew about ancestry, bloodlines, and identity itself. When geneticists began sequencing ancient skeletons from the Viking Age, they expected confirmation, a clean lineage, fierce Scandinavian warriors who carried their blood across the world. But what they found was something far more human and far more complicated. It began in 2020, when the largest Viking DNA study ever conducted was published in Nature. Over 442 skeletons pulled from 80 archaeological sites stretching from Greenland to Ukraine. A collaboration between the University of Copenhagen, Cambridge, and other leading institutions. The goal was simple: to trace the genetic footprint of the Vikings. But when the results came back, they didn't confirm the myth. They destroyed it. Because among those 442 graves were men and women buried as Vikings, with Norse weapons, Norse jewelry, Norse rituals, but whose DNA said otherwise. Some were Slavic, some Gaelic, some even Middle Eastern in origin. They lived as Vikings, fought as Vikings, died as Vikings, but their blood told another story. And that revelation cracked open a truth long buried under saga and song, that Viking was never a birthright. It was an identity you could earn, steal, or be chosen into. A performance written in steel and fire, not in blood. But the question still burned. How did it begin? How did a people defined by conquest become so genetically diverse that their graves hold ancestry from opposite ends of the world? To find that answer, we have to go back, not to the Viking Age, but thousands of years earlier, before the first longship, before Odin's name was ever spoken, to the soil that made the North.
Long before the longships, before the sagas, before the gods of Asgard were ever carved in stone, there was a silence. A northern land still half frozen, carved by ice and wind. And into that silence came the first strangers. They weren't warriors, they were farmers. Around 6,000 years ago, people from the sunlit hills of Anatolia, what we now call Turkey, began moving north, chasing fertile soil and gentler skies. They brought with them something Scandinavia had never seen before: agriculture, language, and the seeds of civilization. But they also brought their DNA. For centuries, they mixed with the hunter-gatherers of the north, people who had survived the Ice Age itself, whose bloodlines carried the memory of mammoth hunts and endless winters. When these two groups met, they didn't just trade crops, they fused. And in that fusion, the first strands of what would one day be called Scandinavian were born. But this was only the first wave. The next came from the east. Across the endless grasslands of modern-day Ukraine and Kazakhstan, a new people rose. The Yamnaya, the steppe horsemen, Bronze Age warriors who carried with them something more powerful than any sword: the Indo-European languages. They swept across Europe, from the Black Sea to the Baltic, leaving their mark not only in speech, but in bone. Their genetic signature, fast, strong, and nomadic, blended into the northern mix, and once again, the blood of Scandinavia changed. Then came another whisper, softer, colder, from the Arctic itself. The Sami, indigenous reindeer herders of the far north, carrying Siberian ancestry thousands of years old. In ancient graves in northern Sweden, scientists still find traces of their DNA, a thread of the wild woven into the Viking genome before the Viking Age even existed. By the time the first Norse stories began to form, Scandinavia was already a mosaic. Southern farmers, eastern warriors, Arctic nomads, their blood layered like pages in an ancient book. Every Viking born after was reading from that book without even knowing it. So when the Viking Age finally began around 750 CE, it didn't start with a single people or a single race. It began with a storm. 1,000 years of migrations and mixtures condensed into one generation, ready to explode outward, across seas, across empires, across the world. Because when the ships finally launched, when the sails filled with northern wind, they carried something far older than the Viking Age itself. They carried the entire history of the world inside them. But what happened next, when those ships reached foreign shores, is where the myth of purity shattered for good. Because what they found wasn't just land, they found others. And those others didn't just vanish. They became part of the Viking world in ways that would change everything.
They found him curled in a boat, his sword across his chest, his shield beside him, bronze clasps still gripping the dust of a cloak that once caught northern wind. Every detail screamed Viking hero. But when the DNA results came back, they didn't whisper, they screamed. He was Pictish, born of the wild Scottish tribes that had once defied Rome. Not Danish, not Swedish, not Norse at all. So why was he buried as one of Odin's own sons? Why was a man of Scottish blood given the most sacred ritual of Norse honor, the boat burial, reserved only for warriors of legend? Because being Viking was never about where you were born. It was about what you became. When his genome was decoded in 2020 as part of the largest Viking DNA project ever conducted, 442 skeletons across 80 sites, scientists didn't just find an anomaly, they found a pattern. Across Orkney, Ireland, and Scotland, archaeologists began uncovering graves marked by Viking ritual, weapons, boats, jewelry, but carrying local DNA. Gaelic, Slavic, even Southern European. Each discovery cracked the myth further. A Viking with Irish blood, a merchant from the Baltic buried with Norse runes, a child raised in a Viking household who carried no Scandinavian ancestry at all. So who were they? Pretenders? Slaves? Or the truest Vikings of all, because they chose to become one? What the graves revealed was astonishing. Viking was not a race. It was a role, a title, a way of life that anyone could claim if they lived it, fought for it, and died by it. To be Viking was to belong to an idea larger than bloodlines, a shared world bound by loyalty, courage, and ambition. If you took up the sword, sailed the longship, or served beneath the raven banner, you weren't imitating a Viking, you were one. And this idea wasn't just symbolic, it was literal.
Because when geneticists examined hundreds of burials, they discovered something profound. The so-called Viking genome was more diverse than any other population in medieval Europe. Every grave was a story of movement, men and women born far from Scandinavia, dying as Vikings, buried as heroes. Some of the DNA pointed south, toward Italy, Greece, even the Balkans. Others pointed east, to Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic, and still others west, to Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. The Vikings had not only conquered lands, they had absorbed them. They didn't just take gold, they took people, ideas, languages, and bloodlines. Their identity was porous, their culture contagious. And yet the irony is this: the farther they spread, the less Norse they became, but the more Viking they were. Because Viking wasn't something you inherited, it was something you earned. Every sword raised under the northern sun, every oath sworn to a sea king, every burial carved into the earth was a reminder that being Viking wasn't about your DNA, it was about your destiny. But among all these graves, there was one that told the story better than any other. A ship buried beneath Estonian soil, holding a family that shouldn't have survived the centuries, but did. 4 brothers, 1 bloodline, and a mystery that would change how we see the Viking world.
It was supposed to be just another dig, a small island off the coast of Estonia, quiet, windswept, forgotten. But beneath the soil, they found something extraordinary. 2 Viking ships buried side by side. Inside, 41 men, all armed, all cut down in the same moment, laid to rest together, their weapons by their sides, their shields stacked like fallen suns. It was a war grave, but not a typical one. Something about it felt intentional, ceremonial, sacred. And when scientists sequenced the DNA from those bones, they uncovered one of the most human stories ever told by history. Because among those 41 were 4 brothers, not in legend, not in saga, but in blood. Their genomes were almost identical, the same parents, the same village, the same valley in central Sweden. They had grown up together, sailed together, and died together. Their bodies lay side by side, silent for more than 1,200 years until the soil finally spoke. Carbon dating placed their deaths around the late 700s, the dawn of the Viking Age, the moment when the Norse world was just beginning to rise. These brothers were among its first explorers, or its first casualties. Their ship had sailed east, not west, not toward England or Ireland, but across the Baltic, into the forests and rivers of what is now Estonia. What they sought, no one knows. Trade, conquest, or perhaps an alliance gone wrong. But what they found was death. Every man in that ship had been slain, swords, axes, arrows, yet their burial was deliberate. Someone, friend or foe, took the time to lay them in rows, close their eyes, and send them off as heroes, not as raiders, as brothers. And that was the strange part, because most Viking burials found across Europe didn't look like this. They were chaotic, foreign men buried in Norse style, local women laid with Viking jewelry, strangers turned into symbols. But the Salme brothers, they were different. Purely Scandinavian, a snapshot of the early Viking world before it fractured, before it blended. They were the echo of the beginning, when Viking meant family, loyalty, kinship, before empire, before myth, before the storm. And yet, even in that single grave, purity didn't last, because alongside those brothers were other men, not related, not from the same region, carrying different ancestries, different origins.
They shared no blood, only fate. And that's the truth that archaeology keeps whispering through the centuries, that every Viking story, even one carved in brotherhood, was already part of something larger, a weaving. The Vikings weren't a single people, they were a tapestry, each thread borrowed, stolen, gifted, or chosen. The Salme brothers died as family, but they were buried beside foreigners who had become their comrades. Their shared death bound them together more tightly than blood ever could. And as the Viking Age unfolded, that pattern only grew stronger. Every raid, every settlement, every conquest added a new thread to the tapestry, until one island on the edge of the world would become its masterpiece. A land forged not by blood, but by bondage. A place where Norse men brought captives from across the sea, and in doing so, created an entirely new people.
When the long ships finally reached the edge of the known world, they found not gold or glory, but silence. A volcanic island rising from the Atlantic fog. Black rock, green moss, endless wind. Iceland. The sagas tell us it was settled by Norse explorers, adventurers escaping kings and law, chasing freedom at the world's edge. But when the bones beneath Icelandic soil were sequenced, the story changed forever. Because half of Iceland's founding population were not Norse at all. They were women from the British Isles, Irish, Scottish, Gaelic in blood and memory, brought west not by choice, but by chains. The men were Norse, the women were captives, and together they forged a nation. In 2018, a team of geneticists published a study that stunned historians. 63% of Iceland's maternal ancestry traced back to the Celtic world. The mothers of Iceland were not Vikings by birth, but their children would be. Some of those women were slaves, some became wives, some may have risen higher, earning freedom, land, even warrior burials of their own. One such grave held a woman interred with a sword, a symbol of honor rarely given to females. Her blood was Gaelic, her burial was Norse, and her story was both. From that union of conqueror and captive, of North and West, came something new, a people who spoke the Norse tongue but carried foreign rhythm in their veins, a hybrid civilization built on contradiction and survival. And that is the pattern the DNA keeps whispering. Viking was never purity, it was transformation. Because even as those ships sailed farther east, to Kiev, to the Volga, to Constantinople, they left behind fragments of themselves and gathered new ones in return. Each voyage a mixing, each generation a rewriting, until the word Viking no longer meant where you came from, but what you dared to become. The truth is simple, and it's beautiful. There was never a pure Viking race, only people willing to cross boundaries others feared to cross. Traders, raiders, captives, rebels, dreamers, all bound by the same hunger to carve meaning from the unknown. So the next time someone tells you the Vikings were a single bloodline, remember the woman from Ireland who became Iceland's mother. Remember the Pictish warrior buried as Odin's son. Remember the brothers of Salme who died beside strangers and called them kin. Because they were the real Vikings, not by birth, by choice. And maybe that's why their story still survives, because it isn't really about them. It's about us. We too are mosaics, carrying the dust of 1,000 ancestors,
the echoes of migrations, the whispers of forgotten names. Our DNA doesn't divide us. It connects us in ways our myths never could. So if you carry a fragment of Viking in your code, know that it isn't a mark of conquest, but of connection. It means that somewhere, long ago, someone crossed an ocean so that you could stand here now. The Viking Age didn't end with the last raid. It ended the moment we realized it lives on inside us, not in blood, but in becoming. And if stories like this one make you see history differently, if they remind you that the truth is often stranger, deeper, and far more human than legend, then stay with us, subscribe, and join the journey, because the next discovery waiting beneath the soil might just rewrite your story, too.